And the British wanted him and his family on their side in the war against the Ottomans. Not because they had a big army, not because they were adding great strength to the military project, but because the British had a lot of Muslims in their army. Most of them from South Asia, what became Pakistan and India. That was a British colony, and they were in the British army. And they were fighting the Ottomans, and the head, the Sultan, was the Khalif, the ruler, the leader of the faithful. So they wanted to neutralize the religious content, the potential that their Muslim troops might hesitate to fight the Ottomans. So for political reasons, they brought in the Hashemites, and when the war was over, they appointed two brothers as the kings. There's more details I'm going to skip over. Syria was involved, but basically they appointed two kings. One, the king of Transjordan, later known as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to this day, and that guy's great-great-grandson, I might be skipping a great, Abdullah is his name, is still the king of Jordan. The other brother at that time, Faisal, was appointed king of Iraq, and that regime was ended with the Iraqi revolution, and his grandson, Faisal II, was executed. And a republic was created in the place of the monarchy in Iraq. Okay? On the other side, the British declared their intention through what was called the Balfour Declaration, and that's a picture of Lord Balfour, to give the other side of Palestine to make a homeland for the Jewish people. Say, how did that come out? What is this homeland for the Jewish people? I put in a picture there of the Jewish brigade that fought in the First World War for the British. They were trained by the British during the First World War. So let me explain a little bit about that Jewish homeland idea. Because by 1920, when this partition happens, 1917 by the Balfour Declaration, that idea of a Jewish homeland, that people had been working on that already for many decades. The idea of a Jewish homeland, Jewish nationalism, is called Zionism. And some people would say that the father of modern Zionism is the guy I pictured here, Theodor Herzl. And he founded the World Zionist Organization in 1897 with the intention of organizing politically and economically a state in Palestine for the Jewish people, right? So years later, 20 years later, that's why the British, one of the reasons the British went along with that idea. In fact, actually, the British wanted to do that much earlier. I have a microfilm copy of 1840s when the British went to the Jews of London and said, why don't you colonize Palestine? It would serve us well. And the Jews of London basically said, we'd rather stay in London. And they weren't that interested in going to Palestine. But by the late 1800s, that idea had really taken traction. And it had taken traction because the wars and the processes that were tearing apart empires in Europe hit the Jews really hard in Europe in different ways. It was particularly bad where most of the Jews were in Eastern Europe. My family's from Eastern Europe, from Odessa, from Łódź, which is in Poland, Odessa is in Ukraine. And I put here pogroms, 1881. I'm not going to get into the whole story of Russian history and the Tsar, but in 1881, Tsar was assassinated, and lynch mobs called pogroms were unleashed, largely by Cossacks, against Jews. So burnings and rapings and murders in 1881. My family left Odessa at that time. Many people left and mostly came to Ellis Island, to New York, right? A small group, a kind of radical group, who said it'll never work in New York. In America, will be just like Europe. They said they got to have they became Zionists and they started to settle Palestine. And they started to send small numbers of people to Palestine. I wrote there, first Aliyah. Aliyah is a Hebrew word. It means going up, but it's used to refer to immigration to Palestine. And in the first 20 years, about 35,000 Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, went to Palestine instead of coming to America or to Western Europe. But some Jews, Herzl was not from Eastern Europe. He did not live as a ghetto Jew in Eastern Europe like my family. He was in Western Europe, where things were very different, where most Jews didn't live in ghettos. I said ghetto Jews. You might, if you didn't know, the word ghetto comes from the word Jew, judo, right? And Juderia, where the Jews live, is the ghetto, right? And that was Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes when I do history here quickly. I know some details that don't fit into this, but you'll excuse me. We can come back and cover that. In Western Europe, Jews enjoyed more emancipation, they say. So they could join universities. In America, we would say they became white folks. And Herzl, and this guy down here, Dreyfus, I wrote this French officer here. They were both, we could say white folks. They were Jewish, but they were integrated, assimilated into the larger society. And Herzl was a journalist, and this Dreyfus was an officer, but Herzl went and covered, Dreyfus was convicted of espionage, and it became an event of great, where the newspapers were covered with anti-Semitic slurs about the Jews. Herzl saw that. A few years later, Dreyfus was released and somebody else was convicted of the crime. But this really was a big event in France in the late 1800s. And Herzl, who was this assimilated Jew, said, I'm joining the Zionist movement, or I'm going to make the Zionist movement, and started to form the World Zionist Organization. So between the political and economic organizing of the World Zionist Organization under Herzl and his sort of Western European folks, and the people who were ready to get up and leave from Eastern Europe, the boots on the ground, so to speak, that's really this emergence, this convergence of a Zionist movement. And they had very different philosophies. Most of those coming from Eastern Europe were lefties. They were socialists, right? And they had very little in common with those Western European Jews. But there was a convergence on these issues. Is there a hand?
Yeah, I just asked it really simply. Were people who left the area at that time, were they considered anti-Zionists? Because you said that the way you phrased it, you think the people who just came to America were just kind of...
There was, I think, very little. Zionism was not really much known. I mean, it was a kind of radical movement.
Traitors among their kind, I guess.
I don't think so. I think it was kind of a radical, a more radical element. And of course, there are different waves of colonization, right? But it was more a radical idea to go to Palestine at this point, at these early points. Okay, it became more popular later, and I'll explain that. Okay. I also have a picture here of some of those early immigrants who set up Hashomer, and you see how some of them have put on the keffiyeh, the hatta of Palestinians, and that's the guard that they set up in 1902. Okay. Now, this immigration to Palestine and the Balfour Declaration, in which they said we're going to create a Jewish homeland, the local Arab population said, wait a minute, what do you mean a Jewish homeland in Palestine? They're not even here. There's a minority here. We're the majority. Arab-speaking people, mostly Muslims, a large minority of Christian Palestinians as well, but mostly Muslims. And they didn't like the idea that a Jewish homeland would be created. There had been a minority of Jews in the land for a very long time, for centuries they were there. But they were like the other Christians, other non-Muslims that were there. They paid certain taxes, they had certain rights, they didn't have other rights, but the idea of a Jewish homeland raised real questions for the indigenous Arabs, who were increasingly seeing themselves as Palestinians. Those ideas started to emerge in a newspaper called Palestine at this time, and writing against the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And in the 20s, there were disturbances, riots in the streets. I put a picture here of Haj Amin al-Husseini, a prominent Jerusalem family, and he led a delegation to Europe in the 1930s to protest the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and toured Europe. There's a picture here of the delegation in London. And by 1936, as I put the immigration numbers growing, in the 20s, 61,000, I'm looking at the Jewish number, 120,000, this big jump during the mandate in 1925. By 1930, 165,000. So they're watching under the Mandate this increasing population of Jews. It's